Hey BookTube, back for another video. This time for another reading update. Last reading update I did was probably early February or mid February. So I'm going to update you about how my reading month for February went and what my plans are for March. So what I've recently finished. I believe I was in the middle or had recently started reading How to Be a Famous Novelist or How I Became a Famous Novelist by Steve Helly. And I was really enjoying it at the time, and it was exactly what I needed. Kind of like just a funny, uh, short book that I could just enjoy. And it turned out I finished it, of course. It didn't take me that long, but it was a lot better than I was expecting it because at the time when I made that video, I was only uh, getting like the funny parts when he was made this decision. He wants to become a famous novelist in order to get back at his girlfriend or his ex girlfriend at her wedding to another guy, and he was going to the bookstore and thinking of all the ways on how to exploit his readers, like what do readers like in their novels, and how to incorporate those to such dramatic and sentimental effect. And that was quite funny, but the novel took a different turn, which I was not expecting at all. There was a number of set pieces, of course, that were being put forward in this novel. One being, of course, the wedding, and two, the meeting of a certain author, which he considered not only his inspiration but also his nemesis. A novelist who's famous because he's uh, writes like these really sentimental kind of feel good literary fiction novels that the kind that become mega bestsellers. Like for our example today would be like The Shack or something. Just a megawatt bestseller that's extremely sentimental and like exploits you emotionally, and he considered that his rival, but also his inspiration because he figures he could be like that too. And of course, he encounters this author, and they have like a public uh, discussion, of course, but it's more like a dressing down. But it was really good, but it was also very strangely dark because the author is a lazy, uh, basically a lazy, depressed guy who can't get his life together and who can't get over the fact uh, that his girlfriend had dumped him in college, and that now he's out of college. Now he's doing some shady work, which also catches up to him later in this novel. Um, and the other thing that surprised me is also how well written this book is. The descriptions of people and the descriptions of places are actually quite fantastic in their sense of evoking place and how these people are. Like, and it's quite funny in some of those descriptions too. But it is really quite a well done book, despite how funny it is, but also with some of the darker twists to it, which are quite appropriate, I think. Because the author is a jerk, a depressed, lazy jerk, so we don't really cheer for him. But he's also, in a sense, self aware, and that becomes a twist at the very end of the novel, too. Uh, the A twist at the end of the novel where kind of it changes your perspective of how you've read this book. And actually, what surprised me is that as soon as I finished reading this, I actually wanted to reread it because that twist, which is not like a super heavy twist, but it's a twist nonetheless that kind of changes how you look at the book as a whole. And that's I quite appreciated that. It was really a well done twist, and not the kind of and uh, I think most appropriately is at the very ending of the book, which I'm not spoiling anything really by saying this. At the very end of the book, he actually reads a novel that isn't trying to be manipulative, but ends up being really good. And he's describing this book in detail, but just how it moved him, and almost how he's incensed that this novel that's completely genuine could move him so, and and how it's like almost against his entire cynical worldview, about what literature and how the world works, because the novelist, as I've said many times, he's a lazy jerk, but he's also characteristically cynical as a 20-something young man, and and that of course permeates a lot of his really dumb decisions in this book that set off kind of like the comedic um, premise. But yeah, at the very end, he enjoys a really good book, and then the last words are like, "I wish I'd written a book like that," or "I wish I could have written a book like that," and it's just perfect, absolutely perfectly done. So I do recommend this book. It's very short. It's very good. Uh, exactly, not just to as like a palate cleanser if you need a funny book, but it's actually like it's a lot. It was more serious than I thought, and serious in a way that worked well, and that was appropriate to the subject matter. And I also read another book on my e-reader here, if I can pull it up. After that, I wanted to read another book that was on my list to read, and I read a John Gardner book on writing. This is an omnibus ebook version, which includes On Becoming a Novelist, On Writers and Writing, which is basically an essay or a deadline prose anthology, and then On Moral Fiction. And it's On Moral Fiction that I did read, which is fairly short. It's also under 200 pages. And I read this basically over a long weekend, and I really did enjoy it. Like it was because the whole premise was something that I can get behind, but the author, I felt like the author kind of lost me for as he went along. Because the very ending, the very beginning, he like defines how unfashionable his views are, because this book was published in the 70s and was very controversial at the time because John Gardner was a fairly well-known name in literary circles. He had published successful novels, and he was also a literary critic and professor. So when he publishes this book on moral fiction, it seemed to get quite a reaction, because he also basically makes the argument that about art in general, but fiction in particular, because that's his specific domain of art that he is engaged in, that fiction should have a moral end to it, like which is a bulwark against nihilism and all the fashionable kind of like postmodern crap of the day, where people, and one particular name is Samuel Beckett that he shows, where Samuel Beckett is a good novelist, he says, or a good writer, but his writing, he thinks, or his books are not fitting under his heading of what he would consider good fiction, because they are good in the sense that, but they also make fashionable what he considers bad views such as like a depressing and almost moralistic nihilism that he thinks makes fiction bad. And I don't know, it's hard to describe exactly what it is, because as the book went along, I thought his argument got a lot more philosophical, and in that sense a lot more muddled and essentially boring. But the beginning I really, really did enjoy, where he defines moral fiction and how he talks about certain writers that fit under what he considers moral fiction, because usually when you think of moral fiction, like, should fiction be moral, it's like fiction should be like crusty and dogmatic and didactic, and it should be like lecturing to you. That's not at all what he means. He means by moral fiction that fiction should be exploring in creative ways how humans should live, and how we the issues that we face, and it should be open-minded and wrestling with these ideas instead of being cleverly cynical and trying to push forward certain views that mock what we consider good and virtuous and and he thinks that that makes fiction bad, and I don't know, it's a lot more depth to his argument than that I can give. I wanted to make a video on it, but I just don't get the book as a totality enough to actually do a video on that, because I would have to reread it a lot closer than I did, and I would have to and I did actually reread certain sections that I highlighted over and over again. I think at least 3 times, just to try to get what he actually means by and included in his analysis, and not just moral fiction, but also moral criticism, where he thinks the work of the critic is to point out when fiction goes against the good, or goes against moral fiction. But the thing is, what I struggled with is, like, what if there's like a novel that's really really done well. It's smart, it's funny, it's extremely profound, but the whole thing is extremely nihilistic. It doesn't really bring positive views, or like it's not meaningful. So it's very entertaining, but it's not doesn't fit his definition. Like, would that be considered bad or immoral literature or immoral fiction? And I think there's he answers that in the book, but I couldn't wrap my head around it enough to fully parse out his views. So that is a book I'll need to go back to, but I do find it extremely interesting and worthwhile engaging. So if any of that sounded in any way interesting to you, chances are you're smarter than me, you'll get more out of it than I did. So I do recommend it, in a sense that, I mean, it is worth reading. And other books that I did finish, let's see. So the other books that I finished are physical. So I finished reading, this I also read that same weekend. This is The Uncommon Reader by Alan Bennett. It's very short. It's basically a novella, about 120 pages. I said in that other video that I wanted to read this, and I did. So I ended up reading it, and it was just a charming book about how the Queen of England becomes a reader late in life, we should say. And it's how would that actually look? Because of course, if you're a big reader and you watch my videos, you know that reading kind of, once you prioritize it, it kind of takes over your life, where your free time, you just want to continue reading, and you live for those moments when you have time to read, and you're always despairing over how many books that there is to read in the world that you want to read, and how little your time is to actually end up reading. So it's like this, so many books, so little time is the phrase that everyone says. But the Queen of England, like, she's got all these public duties that she has to do, and she had certain ways of decorum that were usual to her that all of a sudden have to change because she wants to read more. And like, for one small example is that one day she took a day off, saying that she was sick, which was very unusual for the Queen. Or one time when, or there's a specific moment when she stops really caring about what she wears. I mean, only the very acute eyes and people who are around her would know, or would notice a lot more. But so she's not negligent in that sense, but she will wear the same earrings twice, or whatever, you know. And all these are because she wants to read more. She's sick because she really isn't sick. She just wants to stay in bed and read her book. More of her brain power is going towards thinking about what she's reading than what she's actually wearing. And you know, it goes on like that. And the funniest thing is that the people around her, like the servants and the political figures around her, resent this in her because she wants to talk about what she's reading, and they don't read, and they consider it like this embarrassing, you know, moment when the Queen asks them what they've been reading, and they haven't been reading anything because they don't read, unless they read the paper. but that's not really something that you can talk about as you would a book. And it's really good. It's charming. There's and we get to see like the Queen's opinions and of certain writers, and her evaluation as she grows as a reader. Like, for example, the first book that she picks from this little library that she stumbles across, she finds it boring. But then later in the book, she goes back to the same book and she finds so much more nuance to the book that than she first realized, and she ends up really liking the book, despite what she considered when she first read it. And then at the very end, near the end, she becomes she doesn't want to just read books. She actually wants to end up writing, and she takes her inspiration from Proust, In Search of Lost Time, where at the very end of In Search of Lost Time, the narrator considers that he's been wasting his whole life, but now he thinks in order to make up for lost time, he needs to end up he needs to write about his life and write about everything that happened to him, and she takes inspiration from that and she wants to do the same. And then that leads to the very end of the novel, or the very end where there's a twist, which I'm not going to spoil here, but there's a twist because, of course, this is an alternative reality, so this is not historical in any way. It's just a fun thought experiment of how one becomes a reader, but also how that would work if you were an extremely forward-facing public figure with a very specific personality that you've cultivated. And so and also how you would relate to certain characters. Like, for example, when the Queen reads Pride and Prejudice or Jane Austen, she doesn't relate to the characters as much because she, as the Queen, doesn't really can't really relate to the characters that Jane Austen writes, because Jane Austen's characters have a very different situation in life than the Queen's does. So it takes her some time to get used to relating to certain characters that she otherwise would not have related to. And she also, and I don't know, I'm not going to go on because it's very short and I don't want to spoil anything, but I'm just saying it's a very good read, very quick, and it's just delightful. So there's that. And I don't know, I'll do this first. So I was wanted to read in February. I wanted to read Aristotle's Politics, and this was the edition I was initially going to read it in. I'd read the really long introduction, 65-page introduction. It's very in-depth, very well done. But then when it came to actually reading this translation, I stopped and started. I picked away at it, and I didn't get very far. And I don't know why it was. Is it because I didn't feel like it was welcoming enough? But then again, I've read other Aristotle where I didn't feel welcome at all. So I can't really say why this translation put me off. But it just came a moment where seeing this filled me with dread, and I didn't want to read this edition, because I don't know, the translation seemed fine, though the translator has this little knack of inserting a ton of his own stuff into the translation, where, I don't know if you can see it, no, you can't see that, but he inserts in square brackets a lot of phrasing throughout the translation of his own, which are basically his own clarification notes within the translation. So they're not the words of Aristotle, but yet they're included right there where you're reading them. And I mean, I thought that wouldn't be a problem with me, but maybe it was, and that's why I was putting this off. But I can't really describe why that was a reason, why that was putting me off. So that was like a failed stop and start, so I decided to pick up the Penguin edition of Politics, and that I agreed with right away. So I just picked it up and I started reading. It's formatted similarly to the Ethics, which I also read in the Penguin edition. So it's got, so you got the translation, and then you got the, every new section has this, in italics, this introductory note. So this here and this is all in italics. That's like an introductory note by the translator. And then we got Aristotle. I ended up skipping all of that. I didn't feel like I need those. Not because I'm not. Not because I didn't. I think I'm smart enough to understand Aristotle. It's because I think that it loses momentum in my reading speed, or in my reading. And with Aristotle, I feel like you need to be reading Aristotle closely in order to follow his argument when he goes from this argument and he moves on to another argument. So if I'm getting the translator's thoughts and whatever in my head, that kind of jars me out of Aristotle, and then I kind of read the next section as if it's its own independent section, or like it's the next chapter. And I didn't want that. I just want, because Aristotle, of course, didn't make chapters and whatever and divisions. He just kind of continues along. So I found it easier to just read to here and then start over here, and then continue along. And then the footnotes are all at the very bottom. I mean, same with this, but this one the footnotes are extremely comprehensive, like just layers of footnotes all around. And maybe that's another thing that put me off. I feel like I would need to read all those big sections. Well, here the footnotes are very unobtrusive. There's just a few notes here and there, and the ones that are there are quite helpful. And yeah, so I really got along with this. I just finished this past weekend, and I'm very glad that I did end up picking up the Penguin, because it is much more a beginner's guide if you want to read Aristotle in this version of Aristotle. So I very much appreciated that. And also the last 2 weeks, I've been reading. Well, I made an executive decision. I wanted to read short stories. And I have a lot of volumes of short stories, whether on my e-reader or on my shelves, and I always confused on what to do with them, because I don't want to read them all the way through, like as if it were a novel, because it just doesn't work. And I don't. And most of my short story collections are like big comprehensive things, and I don't mean so much as anthologies where they're from different authors. I mean short story collections from one author. And so what I did is I grabbed all the short story collections that I have on my shelf here, and then I also grabbed a few from my e-reader, ones usually that I haven't actually started or ended up reading, or haven't read a whole lot from, and decided to read 1 or 2 short stories from them. And that's what I did. So I'm going to show you the physical ones, and then I'll show you the ones on my e-copy, or my e-reader that I did. Let's see here. So I'll start off with, I'm not going to go in order, but I read one short story from here, the collected stories, the stories of John Cheever, not the collected, it's just the stories of John Cheever. I read, what is it called? It's the second collection, or the second story in here, The Common Day. I don't know should I go into detail about the short story and what I thought of it? That might take forever, I feel like. Well, okay, I'll preface it by saying this. I read quite a few short stories, just selecting maybe 1 or 2, or sometimes even 3 from a certain volume, and then just going from there, getting a taste, and moving on to the next volume. This one I only read 1 short story, and it was all dependent on just me, how I got along with that short story. And if I liked the short story, I would go back. Or liked the short story I read, then I would go back to that same volume later on. And that's what I ended up doing. And I found a lot of it disappointing, and some of it good, and some of it great. And I'll mention that as I go along. So I read the short story here by John Cheever, and I always forget the title. What is it called? It was The Common Day, and it was just a short story about a younger couple who is at his mother-in-law's place, in like the country, which is like this kind of this grand estate, and it's just kind of like following their routine. They're from the city, so they're not quite used to or accustomed to uh, the country so much. Though the main character is a guy, and he's not comfortable so much in the country. Though he seems very he's not like a city slicker. He's very much seems like very adept in the country. Like he can grab a gun and he can shoot it, and he can set up traps and such, which is what he does in here. And we also have like conflicts with some of the servants, and some conflict between the grandmother and some of the grandchildren, and it really just seemed like the story had no plot to it. It was just kind of like giving us a little window of this certain period of time in their life, and there wasn't really kind of any kind of major event or anything like that. It was just kind of things happening. But the only reason why I ended up actually enjoying the story is because John Cheever, I find, is a good writer. So I didn't quite mind it so much, though the short story is not the kind of story that will end up sticking with me. So I like him as a writer. And the very first story that I've ever read in here, which I did not read this time, but I could have easily have reread it. Goodbye, My Brother. So it's Goodbye, comma, My Brother. That is a very good short story. I do recommend that one. But The Common Day was kind of meh, but in a way where I'm like, I do want to return to this author, because this volume is, almost 800 pages. But that short story itself was fairly weak on any kind of lasting impression. And then I'll do this first. I did read a James Tiptree Jr. story. So this is a science fiction writer, and it's a woman. I don't know what her name is. Alice Bradley Sheldon. There we go. So James Tiptree Jr. was her pseudonym. And she was anonymous for a large portion of her career, so people thought this was a man. And but anyways, I've read a few of her short stories, and I find them well done. But science fiction is still like a genre that I'm still dipping my feet into. So reading them is kind of I feel like I'm missing the point almost. And the short story I read here was like 10 pages. It was, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hill's side, which I don't really understand the title, because the short story was basically about this young journalist who's encountering for the first time this alien space docket, and he encounters and he's looking forward to encountering aliens, and this. He meets a human who works there, and that person who works there basically sits him down and goes on this large rant about aliens, and how aliens are extremely irresistible to humans. Like, humans are so in awe of aliens that you'll basically do anything to become a slave of these aliens, because they're so beautiful, they're so majestic, they're so much grander than you are, and that he said and he's caught up in that enthrallment as well. Like, he's basically, and that's why he works there, and it's also got like a sexual element to it too, and he thinks that this is going to be what destroys the species, and warns this guy about meeting aliens, which of course our main character doesn't, and it just goes on from there. So I don't know. It was basically a meh short story. I wasn't a whole lot impressed with it. The writing is good as well, so I will return to James Tiptree Jr. But again, the short story was just kind of meh. I think I want. So the very first short story I read in this little journey of short stories was a short story by Flannery O'Connor. And the reason why I did that is because I love Flannery O'Connor. I don't know if I've talked about her on my channel before, but I truly love Flannery O'Connor. Um, what? Yeah, I read the short story in here I read is called "Good Country People," and I knew that like basically anything Flannery O'Connor writes, like, not only do I love her writing, but just her stories and like their sort of twisted exploration of humanity is just so compelling, and yet it's almost like a car crash, but you can't look away. But it's more subtle than that because I'll and then this short story is set up sort of on how she usually sets up her short stories, where there's this independent single, formerly married or widow, either a widow or a woman who's divorced. In this case, in that short story, Good Country People, the woman is divorced, and she's got an older daughter. In other short stories, that'll be either like older sons or whatever. But anyways, it's always having to do with this independent woman who's not like considered a vulgar country person. She's more like this person who owns this farming estate, who's single or who's a widow, and has these older children. And the older children are usually like these despicable, completely like foppish, useless characters that think they're better than everyone else. And it's a same gimmick that she uses over and over again, but to different effect, and they always work so well. And this one is no different. The daughter who lives with her is in her 30s, and she's got like a fake leg that from an accident, from a childhood, and she's extremely bitter, but she's also a PhD in philosophy. So she thinks she's better than everyone else, and the only reason why she lives with her mother is because she has a heart condition, where I guess doesn't allow her to teach or to work. So it's expected that she will, I don't know, die early in her life because of this heart condition, but they don't know when. And I guess having her live at home will preserve that. But then she's also, and the Good Country People in the title is what the mother always says, almost condescendingly, but not intending to be condescending. I was like, we just need more good country people, because they're always like of solid stock, and they always just get things done, and they're always so they're so virtuous. And that theory is put to test when a good country boy comes at the door to sell Bibles, and turns out he has a certain eye for this this young woman in her 30s, and things go on from there. Very much how you wouldn't expect it to, and I thought it was very well done. Flannery O'Connor is a master. I would like to consider her one of my favorite writers, but I have not read any of her novels, and I've only read about a third of this volume, so I can't say for sure, but I really want to, because I love her short stories. She's always a winner when it comes to reading a good short story, though her short stories will make you uncomfortable, and in the best way, I think. An author that I really wanted to like this author, is Eudora Welty. And I can't say I dislike her yet, because this is a volume I've never read anything from until this time. And so I read 2 short stories from her. I read Lily Daw and the Three Ladies, which is the very first volume in this collection. And then I read The Wide Net, which is much further in. And I just chose them basically by random. And both of them were complete misses. Not only did I not like, I can't say that they were poorly written, but they weren't Flannery O'Connor, let's say that. And both stories kind of just, they're exactly what I hate in short stories, where things kind of just happen, and you don't really care if there's any kind of profound meaning to it. With Flannery O'Connor, she crafts these stories with like a beginning, a middle, and an end where you're kind of enraptured through the whole way, and then at the very end you're kind of just stunned, and you kind of close the volume, and it's just like, you don't, for me at least, I'm just like, I'm staring at the wall thinking about that short story for for some time after. With the 2 short stories I read in here, I'm just like, well, so what was the point of that? And like, things are just happening. Like, am I supposed to, and I don't think that there's anything worthwhile in these stories in order to find any kind of like deeper meaning. And so like the first story was about this a young woman who is intellectually like disabled, and these 2 ladies in the community want to send her off to a institution, and they are so ecstatic and happy about it because they think this will be really good for her, because this intellectually disabled young woman had like some kind of abusive parentage, and she was saved by these young ladies and whatever, and I guess they can't take care of her, so they want to send her away, and they think this will be a really good thing for her. But in the process, she had gone to a carnival and met some guy there, and who promised that he would marry her, and the premise just goes on from there and kind of just stops. And it's only 9 pages, but it just kind of stops. And I literally thought that there was more to the story. I reached the end of the page, turned the page over, and saw the title for the next short story, and I'm like, wait, that's it? And yeah, it was nothing. And then the other short story that I read, A Wide Net, was the story of a man who goes, a young man who's recently married, or married like 1 year, and his young wife is pregnant, and all throughout her pregnancy she's been very difficult to be with and to deal with, and so he takes one night off and gets drunk with his buddy, and then when he comes home late at night, he finds that she is gone, and that she has left a note saying that she was going to jump into the river and kill herself. And so the whole story is him gathering neighbors in order to grab this wide net and bring it all, like, completely crawl across the entire river in order to find her body. And that's what the whole premise of the story is. And there's all the different characters have different personalities. There's little boys that follow along. There's there's an old wise character who's kind of thinks he's better than everyone else, and they end up catching a lot of fish because you can't really help doing that if you're casting a wide net across a sea, and then there's like a thunderstorm and whatever, and it just, all the gimmicks, the playing of the rustic country people with their accent and whatever, it's just, none of it worked on me at all, and I just wanted the story to be over, to be honest. So 2 bad starts for Eudora Welty. If you know any of her short stories that are really good, please recommend them. I really want to read some good short stories by this author, because I've heard a lot of good things. So then we'll move on to the last physical book of short stories. I read some selections from Hawthorne. I read 2 from Hawthorne, and Hawthorne is an author I've read 2 of his novels, and I've read a number of his short stories, and so he's an author I would very much consider a favorite of mine. The short stories I read were the Ambitious Guest and The Birthmark. And The Ambitious Guest is a short story on this family that lives up in the mountains on a pathway between 2 settlements, so that when people are on their pathway, they usually stop at that house for hospitality. And one of the guests that stops by is this young man who wants to do great things in life. And he's so ambitious, so convincing, that the family kind of gets caught up in his fervor. And because of that fervor, they end up doing something that leads to a tragic end. And that's basically that short story. It was short, and it was a good short story, and because it's Hawthorne, it's exquisitely well written. So that was a good short story. And then the other short story was The Birthmark. I think is one of his more famous short stories, where this crazy scientist fellow somehow marries an extremely beautiful woman, but this beautiful woman has a birthmark on one of her cheeks, and he doesn't notice it or doesn't seem to care about it until after they're married, and then he thinks it's like this wicked flaw on her that mars her beauty, because if that birthmark had only been taken off, she would be the most perfect creature in all of creation. And so he sets his entire scientific devotion to making a potion that will get rid of that birthmark. And of course, that leads to another tragic end, as you can expect. And I like Hawthorne a lot, and that short story is well written and it's thoughtful, but it's so heavy-handed, like Hawthorne usually is. It's very moralizing in not in a bad sense, or in the sense that where he's trying to hit you over the head with symbolism and with these kind of like obvious moral connections. I still love Hawthorne as a writer, but man, that was one of the reasons why when I reread The Scarlet Letter a few years ago, it actually lessened in my estimation, because so much of the fun of intuiting connections and why, like in a novel, intuiting connections and finding meaning and whatnot, so much of that he actually gives you explicitly and makes it so obvious that you can't miss it, and that just ruins some of the fun to me. So I do like Hawthorne as a short story writer, and he is a favorite writer of mine, almost purely because of his writing, though I do have some of my favorite short stories of his too that don't do that, or at least not as obviously. So Hawthorne was a good read. I also read, and then on my e-reader, I read an Ursula K. Le Guin short story in this volume called The Unreal and the Real, and it's the selected short stories of Ursula K. Le Guin. I read only one short story in here, and turns out it was not a good idea, because the short story called Unlocking the Air, which was a good, well-written short story, it was a sequel to the short story that came previously, and I didn't know that. So it's been, a year and a half since I read that other short story. So I was basically reading this short story about some kind of change in government in this Eastern European country, and it's half mythical, half personal, because we get characters in this time, and this like mixture of generations, the mother and a daughter. But it starts off with these like paragraph breaks, and each one has like this is a, and then kind of gives you a taste. So it says, the very first line says, this is the fairy tale. This little paragraph says, this is a history. And then this little paragraph says, this is a stone. And it kind of just goes along like that. And then on the next page, then we start, this is a story, and then it gives us characters. And I think it worked well, but a lot of the references and whatnot were to the story that I vaguely remember from reading previously, so I don't really think I fully got the story. Though, of course, Ursula K. Le Guin is a good short story writer. So I will go back to her stuff. Then I read a short story called, what is it called here? 26 Monkeys and the Abyss. So I read a short story by Kij Johnston, and this is a collection at the mouth of the River of Bees, and basically like a fantasy sci-fi writer, and the premise of the story, of that story, 26 Monkeys and the Abyss, is about a woman who experiences an existential crisis, and in that moment she goes and sees this monkey show where they do like magic tricks and whatnot, and she ends up saying like, I have to buy this, and then goes up to the guy and he sells her the entire show for $1, because that's what the previous owner had done for him, and so he does that to her. And basically it's like this monkey show, and especially their final act where they all get into a tub and disappear, is like this weird symbolism for her own internal struggles with existence and meaning in life. And the story was very simply written, but the story was smart enough that it had some good parts to it, and it had an interesting message. So I will go back to this author, of course. I mean, I was glad to read it, but it wasn't like it doesn't really blow you away, or at least it didn't blow me away. And the final one I want to talk about I actually have two more. I read a Frank O'Connor short story, which I'm trying to look up the title but my e-reader is so incredibly slow that it doesn't want to seem to work. The Bridal Night. That's the short story I read by Frank O'Connor. Doesn't want to give me the title. There we go. Frank O'Connor, The Collected Short Stories. This is also a massive volume, so I don't know how I'll end up reading all of it. But anyways, I read the collected short stories. I read one short story from here, sorry. And it was my second short story I've ever read from this author. And it was just fine. It was a short story of a man who ends up talking with this rustic Irish woman who ends up telling the story of her son who goes crazy or loses his mind because a woman that he loves doesn't want to marry him. And the climax of the story is kind of weird, and it ends with him having to go to a mental institution, which is not a spoiler because we're told that beforehand already, and so I don't know. It was a short story, so I really don't know what the purpose of that short story was, but I guess it was fine in its own way. And then the last short story I read on this e-reader, if my e-reader will actually work on me here, is Lord Dunsany. I read a short story by Lord Dunsany, and I read The Kith of the Elf Folk. So The Kith of the Elf Folk is a short story, and it was a delightful short story. It was well written, and it was the story of these creatures who are kin to elves, but they're not elves themselves, and they distinctly don't have souls. So their entire life is to come out in the evening, in the dark, and to dance in the moonlight and the sunlight on the surface of a certain marsh. And near that marsh is a church, and one certain creature feels a yearning, a longing for a soul, and so a lot of her kin end up making a soul, like they concoct a soul, and they give it to her, and she turns into a young woman, and ends up living a life in a human life for a short period of time, and she ends up not liking it at all. It's not as glorious and as enchanting as she thought it would be, and she yearns to go back to being the creature that she was. But the only way she can do so is if she gives her soul away to someone else who does not have a soul, which is very complicated because humans generally have a soul. And she ends up in her multiple existences, because she ends up doing many different things, like manual work and whatnot, and then she becomes a singer. She ends up finding someone who has a soul and gives away her soul, and then returns back to her homeland. It's a nice story. I'm still not entirely sure what the point of the story was, but it was beautiful. And maybe when I say I don't know what the point of the story is, maybe that says a lot more about me and my inability to process short stories properly, which could very well be, which is why I've always struggled with short stories, and trying to find any kind of purpose in them, because I guess I like more fully fleshed out stories, and the only way a short story can have any kind of contact with me or like reach me is if it packs a punch right away. And I'll say that the last author I do want to talk about that I read short stories for really did do that. And this was the major surprise and a huge, like a wonderful surprise. I read 3 short stories by Shirley Hazard in the collected stories of Shirley Hazard. And I read the first 3 short stories in here, and the first 2 at least were absolutely blowing away, just mind-blowingly amazing. And the reason, one, is because of the author's prose is exquisite, but also because the author has an ear for dialogue and takes these simple premises and just blossoms them into these amazing short stories that are, the first 2 are quite similar, so I'll give a little bit of a summary. The first one is the story of this couple who are separated, but they're not divorced. I get the impression that they're not divorced yet, but they're a couple, and they show up together for public appearance at a party at a friend's place, and the party only takes like a few pages, and then the rest of the short story is her back at his place, and they're basically sitting near each other, just talking about the party and about their own relationship, and it's just so moving and so deep that you get the full sense of all the conflict of the relationship and the reason why she can't quite let go, even though he seems like an insufferable jerk. And it's really, really good. It's so good. And then the second story was much longer. It's like 3 times as long as the first one, and it's the story of a young woman who's inexperienced in love who has an older married man basically pull her into an affair, and it's about her conflicts with this affair. Not so much feeling guilty towards the wife, but even though she's related, I think she's like a cousin to the wife, and the wife invites her over to her country house, sort of to like take care of her, but the dilemma more so is that she falls head over heels for this man and is completely inexperienced in the ways of relationship, and so she can't really see through his own his own deceit, where he's not an evil character in here, but he's just a man who's kind of discontent and looking for a passing fling, and she doesn't see it like that. She ends up falling like head over heels in love for him, and he almost feels guilty that he drew her into this, but yet glad that he got what he wanted, even though it ends in the sense where she is left completely torn. And I don't know, it's not, I'm not describing it well, but the dialogue, the thought process of this young woman, it's just so good. It's so good. That is one of the few short stories I've ever actually gone back. I didn't reread the whole thing, but I did reread all the pieces that I highlighted, and I wanted to just break them down. Why did these resonate with me so much? And it's just, it's so good. I could just go back to that short story and just reread it and reread it and reread it, and it's brilliant writing and brilliant reflections on life and relationships, and I really did adore it. The third short story was good. It was a very different perspective and has good writing, but it didn't really pack the same punch that the first 2 did. But I would still say that short story was better than most of these other short stories that I've talked about already. Good lord, we're almost at an hour, and I still haven't talked about my plans for reading. So my plans, well, I think maybe I'll make a different video for that. What I'm currently reading and what my plans are, because 54 minutes, like no one's gonna watch any more of this, so whenever, I'll do another video on what I'm currently reading and what I want to read in the future, or in the very near future. So we'll leave it there, BookTube.